afternoon. So our speaker in today's Irish Studies seminar, I think, really needs no introduction. Gordon Gillespie has been involved with Irish Studies here in Queen's probably for longer than you care to remember, at least 30 years, in different roles at different times, multiple projects over many years. He's currently visiting researcher at the Institute, and he's working on a long-term project on the displays of flags in loyalist areas of inner city East Belfast, also looking at the impact of COVID on public space, and has been recently also working with Nottingham Trent University with Chris Reynolds in preparing the exhibition currently in the Ulster Museum and online on the Voices of 1974, which includes a study of the oral history of the Ulster Workers Council Strike, which is the subject of today's paper. And I'm sure, as everyone knows, Gordon has published very widely on multiple aspects of the Troubles. He's a great expert on the subject. But he's going to talk to us today about the 1974 Spongers speech revisited, Harold Wilson, Lady Falkender, and David Bowie.
David Bowie, yeah.
So, Gordon.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Well, I suppose my theme today is really about context, and in that line, then, I should really explain how this came about. And as Peter said, I was working earlier on this year with Chris Reynolds of Nottingham Trent on the Voices of 74 project, which is online, the Ulster Museum website. Chris did the interviews. Chris interviewed about 35 people and had a list of set questions they asked them. One of them was on Harold Wilson and the Spongers speech, and why did they think that Wilson said what he said in that speech? And that got me thinking again, even though I'd looked at it, and you sort of like, yeah, why did he say it? It just seems such a bizarre thing to do. So that got me looking at this just again in the broader context and getting away from just purely the Northern Ireland aspect. And I was kind of lucky because there were quite a few books that are relevant to this that came out last year that was able to add to what I was thinking. Hugh Bennett's book on the British Army in the late 60s and through to the mid 70s. Hugh was here earlier this year. Linda McDougall's book on Marcia Williams, which came out this year as well. Nick Thomas Simmons' new biography of Wilson, and Tim Tate's book on the whole spy catcher scandal. So they give me some new material to look at. But what I'm trying to do is kind of set the scene. And so in 1974, Western society appeared to many to be in terminal decline with industrial and economic chaos. Trust in political leadership was also in low supply with the Watergate scandal in the US, Nixon resigning in August of that year, and factors such as inflation, rising unemployment, and industrial turmoil in the UK. Terrorism now seemed endemic in Northern Ireland. The Troubles-related incidents which drew most attention in early 74, before the Ulster Workers Council Strike began, were the IRA's bus bomb on the M62 on the 4th of February, which killed 12 people, and the UVF Rose and Crown bomb on the 2nd of May, which killed 6, while the UVF bombings in Dublin and Monaghan on the 17th of May, during the course of the strike itself, killed 35 people, including 2 unborn babies. And although these were horrific atrocities, they were far from unique in world terms at that time. During the course of the year, there were many major terrorist attacks in Israel, Italy, Los Angeles, Tokyo, as well as the bombing of flight TWA 841 over the Ionian Sea, and another explosion on a flight in South Vietnam. This was in advance of the renewed IRA bombing campaign in England and the attacks in Guildford, Woolwich and Birmingham in October and November. Diamond dogs. In popular culture, Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, which was released in July 74, reflected something of the zeitgeist of paranoia and decay. In the similar vein, David Bowie's studio album Diamond Dogs, recorded between December 73 and February 74, was released on the 24th of May 74, the eve of Harold Wilson's Spongers speech, and seemed to reflect the apparent decay of Western society. The album was originally intended to be a concept album based on George Orwell's book 1984, but the estate of Orwell, Eric Blair, refused copyright, with Blair's widow Sonia calling the notion bizarre, and so only elements of the initial idea remained in the record, which was released. Bowie's post-apocalyptic world, described in Diamond Dog's opening track Future Legend, might perhaps be seen as a dystopian exaggeration of what could have happened in the latter days of the May '74 strike, when the UWC threatened to stop gravediggers working, leaving bodies unburied, and to shut off electricity generation completely, thus bringing the power grid to collapse, shutting off pumping stations and leading to raw sewage flowing in the streets of Belfast. In Northern Ireland, violence was still high, though less than its '72 peak, and those attempting to bring some sort of political stability vested their hopes in the Sunningdale package of December '73, which included a power-sharing executive involving Unionists and Nationalists, allied to a North-South Council of Ireland. Elections to a Northern Ireland Assembly held in June '73, before detailed political negotiations began, had shown an overall majority in favour of the broad plan for power sharing and an Irish dimension, although a majority of Unionists were opposed, particularly on the Council of Ireland, and this Unionist opposition increased as the process of political negotiation progressed. Besides this, politicians were always hostage to the ongoing violence and supporters arguably unrealisable demands. Although the power-sharing executive took office on the 1st of January '74, the Ulster Unionist Party rejected Sunningdale only 3 days later, and Brian Falkender resigned as party leader on the 7th of January, although he remained as chief executive and leader of a rump of pro-Sunningdale Unionist Assembly members. In the background, meanwhile, strands of Unionist and Loyalist opposition have been coalescing in the form of the political, the United Ulster Unionist Council, the paramilitary, the Ulster Army Council, and workers, the Ulster Workers Council. And the combined efforts of these elements would reach a peak in the Loyalist-led revolt against Sunningdale in the form of the UWC strike in the second half of May. In October '73, Egypt, Syria, and other Arab countries attacked Israel during Yom Kippur in an attempt to regain territory lost to the Israelis in the 1967 Six-Day War. The USA began resupplying Israel with weapons, while the Soviet Union also resupplied Arab states. And in response, Middle Eastern countries of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, cut oil production and raised prices to Western nations. Between October '73 and April '74, the price of crude oil quadrupled. Debate over the relative merits of European Economic Community membership, which the United Kingdom and Ireland had entered in January '73, were also ongoing, not least within the Labour Party, where many believed too much sovereignty had been conceded to a supranational body led by faceless bureaucrats. One of these critics was Labour leader Harold Wilson's personal and political secretary, Marcia Williams, who believed that our membership of the European community leads inevitably to a dramatic increase in the administrators unaccountable to any democratically constituted body. There is cause for alarm that ministers can be taken over so smoothly and insidiously, said Williams. Industrial relations in Britain were also in turmoil. In 1970, the Conservative government had been elected with the objective of reducing state intervention and reducing trade union influence. But in '72, the Conservatives made a dramatic U-turn with government intervention and a statutory incomes policy. A national union of mine workers strike in early '72 saw picketing and support from other unions. Secondary picketing was only made illegal by the Thatcher government in 1980. And the strike forced Heath to concede a pay increase of over 20% to the miners. Talks with unions on voluntary pay restraint failed, and this in turn led to a statutory incomes policy. The autumn of '73 saw stage 3 of this policy announced, with a 7% limit on pay increases. An unsocial hours clause could have given the miners more money, although the NUM decided not to accept this exemption. So the overall economic situation was made worse by the impact of the Yom Kippur War. The UK depended on Arab states for 2/3 of oil, but these states blamed the West for supporting Israel in the conflict, and OPEC cut oil production by 25%, and as I mentioned before, quadrupled the price of crude oil. sending a shock through Western economies. Other prices, including food, were also rising, and the general standard of living in the UK was falling rapidly. As all prices rose, coal became more important, and the miners' bargaining position was strengthened. On the 12th of November, miners announced an overtime ban and cut coal production by 30%. In response, the government declared a state of emergency, the fifth under the Heath government. Street lighting was reduced, floodlighting of sports grounds banned, a 50-mile-per-hour speed limit introduced to save petrol, and there were plans for petrol rationing, but these were not introduced. TV broadcasting ended at 10:30 p.m. A government SOS, switch off something campaign, was launched in an attempt to have the public save electricity. But in response, some supporters of the strike produced thousands of stickers with switch on something, and some used more electricity than they normally would have done. This campaign was also referenced by the WUC in the February '74 general election in Northern Ireland, when some election posters used the slogan SOS, switch off Sunningdale. In Britain, railway workers also called an overtime ban and a work to rule, and by 12th of December, newspapers were beginning to ponder the possibility of a general election. The following day, the government announced a 3-day working week from the 1st of January '74, ostensibly to save electricity and get through the winter without power cuts. The government also introduced an emergency budget and announced cuts in public spending. In a national broadcast, Prime Minister Edward Heath said it would be the hardest Christmas we have known since the war. The Trade Union Congress intervened in an attempt to resolve the situation with the miners by saying that other unions would not use a special settlement for the miners to claim larger increases for themselves. But the Conservative government rejected this offer, partly on the basis that the TUC could not enforce it in any case, and the position was deadlocked. The situation worsened after the government said the economic position was not as bad as they feared, and they might move to a 4-day week. In response, the NUN balloted members, and on the 24th of January, voted by 81% in favour for an all-out strike. On 7th of February, Heath called a general election, with the Conservatives expected to win. This led to a short but intense election campaign. In his diaries, Labour leader Harold Wilson's advisor, Bernard Donoghue, noted that Wilson liked to write his own speeches, but this told on Wilson during the election campaign. And as he said, this inspired bouts of ill temper in the party leader and some very rough patches in the speeches. Despite this, the sense of crisis was receding. The ban on TV after 10:30 p.m. ended, the weather was good, the railway strike was called off, and the miners reduced the scale of picketing. Labour, meanwhile, began to emphasise the issue of price increases, which was shown to be a major concern for swing voters. In the election, both Conservatives and Labour lost votes, while the Liberals and Scottish National Party gained. In the aftermath of the election, which produced no overall majority, Heath approached the Liberals to form a coalition government, but this failed over the issue of proportional representation in UK elections, while the WUC also rejected Heath. Heath resigned and a minority Labour government took office. In the UK as a whole, the general election failed to provide a party with an overall majority. In Northern Ireland, however, anti-Sunningdale candidates ran on the slogan, "Dublin is just a Sunningdale away." This drew on unionist fears of the extravagant scale of the proposed Council of Ireland, and comments like that of the SDLP's Hugh Logue, who said on the 17th of January that the Council of Ireland was the vehicle that would trundle unionists into a united Ireland. The WUC won 11 of the 12 local seats, raising major questions about the future of the Northern Ireland Executive and Sunningdale deal as a whole. Nevertheless, unionists were deeply concerned about the attitude of the incoming Labour government, and Wilson in particular, who seemed to be, to them, extremely pro-nationalist. On the 25th of November, 71, 25th of November, for example, Wilson had announced in the Commons a 15-point plan for what he termed a solution to the Irish problem, by creating a united Ireland within approximately 15 years. Wilson had also met IRA leaders in Dublin on the 13th of January 72, but to no effect. In Britain, the chief concern of the new Labour government centred on the economy, and particularly on the miners' strike. Donoghue was quick to note not just the economic but also the political power of the unions in Britain at this time. He commented, "Of course, we grasped every detail of the miners' dispute, probably did not realise that it had unwittingly launched a long power struggle between the unions and central government, which was not simply particular to Tory political obstinacy, but would involve major abuses of unaccountable power by the trade union movement." Wilson's physical and to some extent mental powers were also beginning to show signs of decline. Donoghue commented that Harold Wilson was by 74 old for his 58 years, tired, often unwell, seeing nothing left to prove as a politician other than to achieve certain records of time in office, and knowing that after October 74 he would not stand for office again. On the 6th of March, the miners' strike ended following the offer of a 35% pay increase from the Labour government. Yes, 35%. A mere 2 days after it had taken office, and the 3-day week ended the following day. Another background factor during this period may have been Wilson's somewhat paranoid state of mind at the time. He believed he was constantly spied on, although an MI5 investigation claimed that no such evidence supported this. It was not until 1977, however, after Wilson had retired as Prime Minister, that these accusations became public. Wilson was not completely wrong in his suspicions. MI5 held substantial files on Wilson under the name of Norman John Worthington. Peter Wright of Spycatcher fame was convinced that Wilson was a Soviet spy based on his many trips to the Soviet Union, as well as his close links with a group of East European emigre businessmen, including Joe Kagan of Ganax Raincoats fame, if any of you are old enough to remember that. Rudy Steinberg, Harry Kissin, and even Robert Maxwell. And you should try trying to find a photograph of Harry Kissin, because all it turns up is Henry Kissinger, despite how often I tried. It appears that a plot of sorts to fix Wilson using the accumulated MI5 information was contemplated by a right-wing group, which included some MI5 members in the period leading up to the February 74 election. However, Tim Tate notes that gradually the illegality of this plan dawned on the plotters. The initial group of 30 dwindled steadily until by the end there was only one man left in favour, Peter Wright. Despite an upsurge in IRA and UVF bombings, Northern Ireland remained largely background noise in Britain. While there was little confidence that the Sunnydale package would endure, Wilson continued to express his support publicly, including during a one-day visit to Northern Ireland on the 18th of April. Privately, however, Wilson was more concerned with events in Northern Ireland than appeared to be the case in public. In the House of Commons on the 13th of May, Wilson revealed details of IRA plans which had been captured by the RUC during a raid on a house in Belfast on the 10th of May. The plans, which were something of a Provo wish list, aimed at the IRA taking control of Catholic areas of Belfast and destroying Protestant areas such as the Woodvale and Sandy Row. The scheme was widely referred to as a doomsday plan. However, another doomsday document was also being considered. In early April, Wilson floated the idea of withdrawal from Northern Ireland with Donoghue and Press Secretary Joe Haynes, and set up a committee of officials to pursue the idea of withdrawal. At a cabinet meeting on the 10th of April, Wilson also suggested a small group of ministers be established to suggest various contingency plans. Surprisingly, Home Secretary Roy Jenkins would be excluded. Wilson asked for the implications of withdrawal from Northern Ireland to be considered, even though apart from any other considerations, this ran counter to the result of the border poll held little more than a year earlier. But a report was produced in late April. The Foreign Office opposed the plans, believing it would undermine the UK's credibility as a reliable ally. But despite this, Wilson continued to promote the idea of withdrawal, and in a document of the 31st of May, suggested Dominion status for Northern Ireland. Other issues closer to him appeared to cause more division. On the 20th of May, Wilson told his advisors that he was considering giving his long-term personal and political secretary, Marcia Williams, a peerage, leading to a row with Press Secretary Joe Haynes. In March, only months before the announcement of Williams's peerage, it was revealed that she, her brother and sister had been involved in a controversial property development deal, which had reputedly resulted in a substantial financial profit. While there was nothing illegal in the deal and the press were undoubtedly intent on attacking Wilson via Williams, There was nevertheless something unsavoury about a senior Labour figure making substantial financial gains through property development at the height of the financial crisis, when ordinary people were finding it hard to make ends meet. Despite this, Wilson continued to defend Williams by drawing out the niceties of the situation and saying, "I've always drawn a distinction in my speeches between property development and land speculation. I believe, and we are committed to this, that the only way to deal with these problems is for all land required for development and redevelopment to come into public ownership." There had long been speculation that Wilson and Williams had had an affair in the past, although she denied it, and the award was viewed by some critics at least as Wilson awarding his former mistress with a peerage. In April this year, Haynes revealed that Wilson had indeed been having an affair at this time, although not with Marcia Williams, but with Deputy Press Secretary Janet Hewlett-Davis. Haynes commented that though he was borne down by weariness with politics and the onset of the dementia which would eventually kill him, she undoubtedly increased his morale in the last 2 years or so before he retired. On the 14th of May, the loyalist workers' organisation, the Ulster Workers Council, announced an all-out strike in Northern Ireland in opposition to the continuing implementation of the Sunningdale Agreement and called for fresh assembly elections. The following day, loyalist paramilitary organisations threw their support behind the strike, and unionist politicians also announced their support several days later. The first mention of events in Northern Ireland in Donoghue's diary during the course of the UWC strike came on the 20th of May, when he noted that a state of emergency had been declared in Northern Ireland the previous day. As he said, Ted Heath's political solution of the Sunningdale Conference was about to collapse. If that went, there was nothing but the unmentionable, i.e. British withdrawal from Northern Ireland. Marcia Williams' peerage, meanwhile, remained a major point of contention within Wilson's kitchen cabinet, and on the 21st of May, Donoghue noted, "Robert Armstrong, then Principal Private Secretary, told me that the Chief Whip, Bob Mellish, had warned him that there would be consternation in the Parliamentary Labour Party over Marcia's elevation. She wrote me a very happy letter. She's sitting at home waiting for her peerage. The peerage has brought her happiness, and Harold Wilson has bought himself a little piece by giving it to her." In the second week of the strike, events in Northern Ireland finally appeared to be demanding more attention. On the 22nd of May, Donoghue mentioned there would be no decision on a subsidy for Harland and Wolff until the strike was over. Shipyard workers were viewed as supporters of the stoppage. On the 23rd of May, an emergency cabinet meeting on Northern Ireland was held from 6:30 to 9 p.m. After the meeting, Wilson said it is shit or bust on Northern Ireland, and it would push Marcia off the headlines. Despite Wilson's hopes, it was Marcia Williams' ennoblement which grabbed the attention of the press when it was announced the following day. Williams was one of 15 people who were awarded a peerage by the Prime Minister, but only Williams grabbed national attention. "Now it's Lady Marcia," was the Daily Mirror's front page headline. Most newspapers ran Marcia Williams' peerage announcement as the front page story, and the award of a peerage to Williams was widely seen as outrageous cronyism. Dominic Sandbrook noted of the political response. At Westminster, Conservative MPs recalled that the Roman Emperor Caligula had tried to make his horse a consul. In Downing Street, aides were sunk in gloom. Until the very last minute, Haynes and Donoghue had tried to change the Prime Minister's mind, but to no avail. Even the Queen was reported to have raised a quizzical eyebrow when she was shown the final list. Despite political controversy circling around the Marcia Williams announcement, Wilson was forced to spend much of that day dealing with Northern Ireland affairs. Donoghue noted that HW was deep in Ireland on Friday and Saturday when he made a very poor broadcast, which I played no part in writing. Joe was away as well. Talks at Chequers, attended by Wilson, the NI Secretary of State Merlin Rees, Defence Secretary Roy Mason, and Attorney General Sam Silken, and senior executive members Falkender, Jerry Fitt, and Oliver Napier, lasted from noon to 4:40. A statement issued after the talk said there would be no negotiations with those who operated outside constitutional politics. Later, the Cabinet made held a special meeting on Northern Ireland. And during this meeting, Wilson spoke of the lack of government control on the ground and the attempt by extremists to establish an unacceptable neo-fascist government, a description used by Jerry Fitt. Significantly, Chris Ryder has noted that a minute circulated to the Cabinet on the 24th of May by Cabinet Secretary John Hunt noted, if we do nothing, the executive will collapse over the weekend. On the other hand, an attempt by the British Army, in effect, to run the country would require the commitment of unacceptable forces and would probably fail. For Ryder, it was the powerlessness of the Army's position that was the final clincher. This apparent powerlessness in the face of the strike would undoubtedly have added to Wilson's frustration and played a part in how he drafted his speech. Journalist Robert Fisk's near contemporaneous account of the strike, The Point of No Return, the strike which broke the British in Ulster, contains interesting nuggets of information on the development of the speech. Fisk claims that an early draft made reference to a rebellion against the Crown, while the UWC were held up as fascist demagogues and the people of Northern Ireland were treated as long-suffering moderates who only wanted the strikers' yoke taken off the shoulders in order to return to work. By early afternoon, however, Wilson had changed the tone of the speech, according to Fisk, abandoning the executive to their fate. It was the Prime Minister's own fear of the executive's imminent disintegration, believes Fisk, that his belief that this collapse would contaminate the stability of his own government if he continued to support it, that made the coalition's abandonment inevitable. When Wilson's speech was telexed to the executive at Storm Castle, it astounded those who read it. To Falkender, it was calculated to incite the united fury of the Protestants in Ulster. Wilson intended to tell the 1.5 million people of the 6 counties that they were outside the pale of British citizenship. Fisk also claims Falkender subsequently went to see Rees to complain about the damage the speech would do, and although the reference to rebellion was removed, the Sponger's speech remained. Sponger's phrase remained. Falkender noted that he received a copy of the speech about 2 p.m, saying, "I was surprised and alarmed when I read it, because it merely seemed to dump everyone in Ulster together as reprobates and insult them to no purpose. They were sponging on British democracy," the text said. Falkender spoke to Rees, who in turn said he would speak to Wilson, although Rees said he could not guarantee that the text would be amended. Falkender noted that while some of his objections were met, probably the removal of the rebellion reference noted by Fisk, the Sponger's phrase was still included. In advance of the speech, the UWC strike committee, the UWC, get me UUUs mixed up, the Ulster Workers Council Strike Committee, who expected to be arrested shortly afterwards, released a statement responding to a leaked version of the speech, which used the word rebellion, in which they commented, "The Ulster Workers' Strike is not an act of rebellion against the lawful authority, but a protest within the law against the denial of the democratic rights of the majority of the Ulster people." Their statement blamed the Labour government for ignoring the outcome of the February general election in Northern Ireland and pointed out that the executive did not have widespread acceptance as was required by the relevant legislation. At 10:15 on the evening of Saturday, the 25th of May, Wilson made a national television and radio broadcast on the BBC. Commentators on the UWC strike often focus on the impact of Harold Wilson's nationally broadcast speech in terms of its strengthening unionist opposition to the Sunningdale Agreement. In broader terms, the speech is often seen as the final nail in the coffin of a dying Northern Ireland executive. The speech is often reduced in shorthand to the Sponger's speech, highlighting the best known element of Wilson's tirade to the extent that it encouraged supporters of the strike to create badges with pieces of sponge attached to highlight their support for or ironic acceptance of the name Spongers. However, this fails to fully take into account the overall content and tenor of the speech. The sponging on British democracy comment was not something which was a different tone from other elements of the speech, but rather the payoff to earlier elements which built to the most notorious part. Wilson's speech confirmed unionist views of how they believed the Wilson government saw them. They felt mistreated and misrepresented. In the unionist worldview, they had been continually asked to make concessions without nationalists being asked to do the same, although clearly this was not how nationalists would see things. Unionists saw themselves as being on the front line in opposing the IRA terrorist campaign, but in return had been abused and blackguarded by the Heath and Wilson governments. Unionists believed that they were fighting for democracy and the integrity of the United Kingdom, and paid for this in pain and blood. Wilson's speech turned this on its head, and argued that it was the people of Northern Ireland who should be grateful for British support. Critics of the speech can readily point to the main themes of Wilson's speech as being a combination of hypocrisy, othering, and condescension. The apparently hypocritical attitude of Wilson in having supported the miners' strike and then subsequently attacking the UWC strike was an easy point for loyalists to make. Wilson argued that the UWC strike was not a real strike because it was not directly about paying conditions, though critics could in turn point to the political element of the coal miners' strike. Indeed, the February 74 general election had been fought by the Conservative government on the very issue of who governs Britain, the government of the trade unions. In a 2015 lecture, Vernon Bogdaner also mentions a meeting at 10 Downing Street between Heath and the miners' leaders before the February election, when NUM Vice President Mick Magahey reportedly said he intended to break the government's pay policy in order to get Heath out of office. And this was clearly a directly political objective. Electoral legitimacy was also an issue. In his speech, Wilson commented, "They, strikers, have decided, and without having been elected by a single vote, who shall work in Northern Ireland and who shall not." Similar charge could have been laid against the unions in Britain. Wilson claimed that 1/3 of the people, i.e. nationalists, had been excluded from power under the old system. However, based on the results of the February UK general election, the new system had effectively excluded an even larger number. Wilson claimed he had supported the Conservative policy on Northern Ireland while in opposition, but failed to mention his controversial 15-point plan of November 74, aimed at bringing about a united Ireland. The speech was more than merely one aimed at a British audience, but also seemed designed to represent Northern Ireland as a place apart. The speech was replete with remarks which othered Northern Ireland in general and unionists in particular, while at the same time emphasising and contrasting this with British party unity with regards to Northern Ireland and the Commons. In contrast, arguably only one statement might be interpreted as including Northern Ireland equally within the UK when he spoke of strikers breaking the law and intimidating the people of Northern Ireland, their fellow citizens and our fellow citizens within the UK. The condescending tone of the speech reached a peak with the comment of strike supporters sponging on British democracy, but was not the only such comment with a similar intent. In the course of the speech, he noted, "There is nothing to fear here and they know it. We will not negotiate on constitutional or political matters in Northern Ireland with non-elected, self-appointed people." It was not clear whether this remark included MPs who supported or were part of the strike coordinating committee, such as William Craig, Ian Paisley and Harry West, while the strike committee chairman, Glenn Barr, was a Vanguard Assembly member. For Wilson, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Northern Ireland Executive provide the only basis for peace, the only basis for order and good government in Northern Ireland, which interestingly is almost exactly what the title of the UUP manifesto was in '73. Wilson also remarked, "We recognise behind this situation lie many genuine and deeply held fears. I have to say that these fears are unfounded, that they are being deliberately fostered by people in search of power." And this statement was clearly at odds with Wilson's doomsday plan. He also commented, "When we see the kind of arrogant, undemocratic behaviour now going on, that the patience of citizens, parents, taxpayers becomes strained." In the final analysis, however, the section of the speech which had most impact was the spongers paragraph. "The people on this side of the water, British parents, have seen their sons vilified and spat upon and murdered. British taxpayers have seen the taxes they have poured out almost without regard to cost. Over 300 million a year this year, with the cost of the army operation on top of that, going into Northern Ireland. They see property destroyed by evil violence and are asked to pick up the bill for rebuilding it. Yet people who benefit from all this now viciously defy Westminster, purporting to act as though they were an elected government. People who spend their lives sponging on Westminster and British democracy and then systematically assault democratic methods. Who do these people think they are?" This section encapsulated what might be interpreted as the three main themes of Wilson's speech: hypocrisy, condescension, and othering, into a single paragraph, and had the effect of condensing all three elements into 5 sentences to memorable effect. There's widespread acceptance, both in comments made at the time and subsequently, that Wilson's speech was a disaster. Even those close to Wilson wanted to put as much distance between themselves and the speech as possible. Returning from holiday on the 29th of May, having been away between the 24th and 28th, Donoghue noted in his diary, dealing with Ireland, the handling of it over the weekend by the civil servants in the Northern Ireland office was not good. HW's broadcast on Saturday attacking spongers in Ulster was disastrous. It was the first statement by the PM in this government in which Joe and I played no part. At this time, the newsletter was the best public weather vane of unionist opinion. On the 27th of May, the newspaper responded to Wilson's speech by taking what other times would be seen as a strongly loyalist tone, suggesting that the strikers wore medals. The paper attacked both Wilson and Falkender and highlighted a number of unionist grievances which they believed had created the ongoing situation. Neither Wilson nor Falkender apparently has yet realised that Northern Ireland can no longer be governed without the consent of the majority of the public. Mr. Wilson, lashing out at thugs and bullies on the scene of the national protest strike, insults us when he makes no reference to the IRA death and destruction rained down on our province for 5 years at the direction of masterminds sheltered and succoured by the Southern Republic. And when he comes to his most heavy-handed finger-wagging admonition on the alleged total and unreasonable rejection of the will and decision of the Sovereign Parliament, he insults us once again. In this regard, it is time he knew the realities, which clearly he will not hear from representatives of the now teetering ersatz Stormont executive. Maybe the hour's come for the Workers' Council to ask senior citizens among its so-called sponger thug supporting demonstrating for justice and freedom to consider wearing their British service medals. Obviously, something more has to be done to identify Mr. Wilson, the real human answer to the question broadcast so crudely to the nation: who do these people think they are? A UDA statement on the 26th of May also attacked Wilson's comments by saying the accusation that we are sponging is contemptible, and it is a typical Wilson verification when he is on quicksand. We have never been Oliver Twist at any table. UUP leader Harry West responded to the speech in a television broadcast on the night of the 26th of May. West emphasised the widespread support for the strike and attacked the executive as a system by which government in our country is rigged and manipulated by people who are not answerable to the electorate. In response to Wilson's comments, he added the organisers of the strike are not a small group of thugs and bullies. They are responsible trade unionists and mainly ex-servicemen. They are given expression to what is deeply held by people at every level. Supporters of the Sunningdale Agreement also saw the speech as unnecessarily insulting, but were disappointed by a lack of specific commitment for action to undermine the strike. Among those, some Sunningdale supporters, there was also a feeling that Wilson's speech was more politically calculated than Sunningdale opponents gave him credit for. There was a belief that Wilson had made the decision to throw the executive under the bus, and that the heated nature of the speech was being used as cover to distract from this fact. The Belfast Telegraph, which took a pro-Falknerite line throughout the strike, was more circumspect in its criticism of Wilson, merely noting of the speech that parts of which were couched in language which he ought to have known better than would raise the temperature rather than cool it. In his autobiography, Faulkner said that immense damage had been done by Wilson's broadcast, which had brought out provincial feeling against him and vastly increased popular support for the strike. Ken Bloomfield, the permanent secretary of the Northern Ireland Executive, later recalled that as he and Faulkner scanned the draft version, we agreed that in a number of respects its language was unhelpful and ill-judged, designed more to clothe Wilson and his government in the apparel of rectitude than to make any helpful impression on Northern Ireland opinion. On the final version of the speech, he commented, listeners in Northern Ireland who have been risking their lives day and daily in the face of appalling terrorist threat and who had continued to work in the face of great difficulties or had been turned back from work when the forces of the state had failed utterly to support them, listening with indignation as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom classified them alongside the thugs and bullies of the UDA and UVF and the demi-constitutional politicians of the WC as spongers. Falkender Unionist and Executive Minister of Education Basil McIver, meanwhile, commented on the Spongers' remark that this ill-judged statement knocked the props from under the executive. After this, we were really rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic. Next day, thousands of tiny sponges appeared pinned to the lapels of the loyalist jackets. On the eve of Wilson's speech, the Irish News had expected the army to take control of petrol stations and fuel supplies, while predicting that electricity could see a complete shut-off by the weekend. On the Monday after the speech, its editorial spoke of the broadcast letdown and commented, "We were all keyed up to expect ministry hints of the British government's plans to deal with the perilous situation. Mr. Wilson revealed nothing, only his own contempt for the way the authority of the Assembly Executive had been taken over." Constitutional Nationalist political opinion echoed this view. Paddy Devlin, at the time an SDL minister in the executive, found Wilson's television address a massive anticlimax. As Devlin said, he ended up again in total absurdity by doing nothing rather than calling the loyalists spongers. Whatever else may be said of them, the loyalists are mainly people who have worked hard all their lives for their families and community. They've rightly earned everything they have received from private or public employment, and they're entitled to state benefits. Their political and constitutional fears I understood and sympathised with. I could not, of course, approve the methods they were using to express them. Austin Currie, another SDLP executive minister, also believed that the nation Wilson spoke to was more the British nation than the Irish unionist or nationalist. Instead of a commitment to firm action to restore law and order, his references to spongers only succeeded in provoking Protestant anger and solidifying support for the strikers. Then Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs Gareth Fitzgerald saw Wilson's comments as an insult to the entire community of Northern Ireland, adding, in the midst of this appalling crisis, he momentarily succeeded in uniting both communities in Northern Ireland in hostility to that insult, while at the same time making it plain by what he did not say that no serious attempts would be made either to restore order or restore electricity supplies. Within days, the situation had reached a crisis point as power generating plants appeared to be on the verge of shutting down. Falkender approached Secretary of State Merlin Rees to negotiate with the strikers. Rees refused and Falkender resigned. With no unionist representation in the executive, it self-evidently did not have widespread political support. The SDLP and Alliance were dismissed and the Sunningdale experiment ended. 10 years later, in May 1984, how was Wilson's speech remembered? Judging by the local newspapers, not very well. Local politics focused on the UUP decision to end its boycott of the then current Assembly. In Britain, there were the deaths of Eric Morecambe and newsreader Reginald Bosanquet, both on the 27th of May, while NUM President Arthur Scargill was arrested at Orgreave Coke Plant in Yorkshire during the miners' strike on the 30th of May. Internationally, there were reports on the ongoing Los Angeles trial of John DeLorean for drugs dealing and the forthcoming visit of President Reagan to Ireland. So it's just coincidentally, Arthur Scargill was arrested for stopping people selling coke while John DeLorean was on trial for selling coke. Locally on the 25th of May, the newsletter carried an article on a young Enniskillen actor called Adrian Dunbar, who 30 years later would speak at a conference on the UWC strike held at Queen's. David Bowie, meanwhile, would release the studio album Tonight in September 74. The only significant piece on the UWC strike in May 84 came in the newsletter, which reported that in a BBC radio documentary, Craig and Rees confirmed, to no one's surprise, that civil servants had leaked information to the UWC. Former UUP Executive Minister Roy Bradford, meanwhile, claimed that a mole in the UWC had leaked information to Army intelligence. An article in the newsletter by Bradford on the 14th of May mentioned the impact of Hugh Loeb's comment of the Council of Ireland trundling unionists into United Ireland, but made no mention of Wilson's speech. So in conclusion then, the days around Harold Wilson's Sponger speech marked the confluence of a number of significant events, often lost by merely focusing on one particular theme or strand. It's hard to believe that the controversy surrounding Marcia Williams' peerage did not impact on Wilson's thinking when he was writing the Spongers speech. The release of David Bowie's classic album Diamond Dogs on the eve of the speech also provides something of a soundtrack for the times through its post-apocalyptic predictions. Like Bowie's album, Wilson's speech has also echoed down the years. Much later, however, Wilson remained unrepentant about his sponging remark. In the final term, he commented, "The idea that I was seeking to get across was that Ulster was always ready to come to Auntie for spending money, expressing their thanks by kicking her in the teeth. The phrase I used was open to criticism and was picked up by the extremists. In no time, the Reverend Ian Paisley was buying sponges, small pieces of which were put in the buttonholes of his supporters, no doubt as a badge of honour." To paraphrase Talleyrand's comments on the Bourbons, Wilson appeared to have learned nothing and forgotten nothing. In May '74, David Bowie's future legend had predicted no more big wheels, and 4 days after the release of Diamond Dogs, that prediction had come true, at least as far as the Northern Ireland Executive and Sunningdale were concerned. From a different perspective, the same could be said of the UWC Strike Committee. Having forced the resignation of Falkender and the collapse of the Sunningdale experiment, unionist support for the strike evaporated, and the strike leaders were forced to call an end to the stoppage. They had destroyed the Sunningdale deal, but not changed the overall trajectory of British government policy. Similarly, while Wilson's Sponger speech may not have caused the demise of the Sunningdale deal, it is reasonable to see it as the final nail in the coffin. It's tempting to try to apply David Bowie's lines from Big Brother, "He'll build a glass asylum with just a hint of mayhem," to Wilson's speech and broader events of the time, but attempting to make a direct comparison with the album as a whole is, just like Wilson's Sponger's speech, taking things too far. That's it. Thanks, folks.
Thanks very much, Gordon. So we can take questions from people in the room, also with an audience online. So raise your hand digitally if you want to. Yeah, Brian, let's start with you.
Well, thanks very much. That was fascinating. But I wonder if you go over the process
just unveil my credentials.
If you could just go over the process by which the speech got written. You said that Wilson was in the habit of writing his own speeches, but he was tired at this time.
Yeah.
And but Haynes and Donoghue seem to have played an important part in revising speeches or advising on them. But Donoghue wasn't there because he was on holiday. Yeah. Haynes mysteriously was out of the picture somehow, and a draft circulated.
Yeah.
There was some modification, but the Spongers haven't got that. Who was responsible for the Spongers?
As far as I'm aware, again, if you believe, there's a gentleman called Paul Bowie, who some of you might have heard of, and I've heard Paul say a few times, and he might correct me if I'm wrong, but if my recollection is right, Paul mentioned a few times that it was Wilson himself that put the Spongers piece in. That it was actually deleted a couple of times by the civil servants, and Wilson put it back in. So the rebellion comment, rebellion against the government, that was taken out, but he was insistent that the Spongers speech went in. So I think it's pretty accurate to say that was Wilson's own baby.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, Graham.
Yeah, just a bit of Wilson history, because he obviously had issues with Northern Ireland dating right back to the Second World War when he was at the Board of Trade, and he was very unimpressed by the Stormont government's handling of the war effort and so on and said so. Then there was the time in '65 when he was in power, and the unionist MPs voted with the Tories against his nationalisation of steel bill, which caused them great irritation. So there was accumulation, I think, of grievances on his part when it came to Northern Ireland unionists, which probably just burst out at that particular moment in the context, as you described, of great stress and failing capacity, I think.
Yeah, but it's just, it's always seemed to me that the tetchiness with unions was out of all, it was much larger than you would have expected to be. With somebody who was a statesman of that scale, you got to separate your own sort of personal opinions as much as possible from some of the broader things. And he just seemed to be, I absolutely agree with you, Graham, about that, the sort of like all this background to it, but it just, I fail to understand it. You can only look at his personality. And he seems to me, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert in Wilson particularly, but he seems to me a sort of guy who would be totally loyal, like Marcia Williams. He could be totally loyal to individuals no matter what they did. And on the other hand, he could be quite, irritated about things, and it seemed to be, he just got a thing about the unionists. It would be interesting if I knew more about it, to go back to the start and see where that all came from. Because even, taking into account what you're saying, it still seems, out of all proportion. I don't know. Yeah.
You've demonstrated, and it's very interesting, you've demonstrated the value of focusing on a particular event or something that's of interest and it radiates out, and it seems to give you, as you said, there's some context. But if you were to widen the lens and go into the 60s, you didn't once in your talk mention about the convention at Westminster. Don't mention Northern Ireland. If you go in the 60s and early 60s, there were MPs who had a lot of Irish people in their constituencies who kept trying to get on the agenda that there's discrimination in Northern Ireland, etc., etc. They couldn't do it. In fact, what is the book? Power Without Responsibility. So in the 60s, you had things falling through the cracks or not getting attention because of that convention. It was actually very powerful. And then from about 66, kicking and screaming, the British government, or whatever hue, was drawn into having to pay some attention.
Yeah.
And then also, I can't look at 74 without thinking in terms of what I see as one of the most influential decisions by the British government, and that is internment in the way that it was implemented, and that was 95% or something Catholics nationalists. So I'm really saying, I think there's a tension between narrowing your lens and getting all the richness that you've come up with, and looking at the bigger picture in terms, as I say, of the British government did not pay attention, didn't, for example, let Faulkner call the shots in 72 as regards internment, despite advice that was a bad idea. So how do you reconcile it? Because you made it sound as though the British government were kind of very involved in Northern Ireland. In fact, they weren't until about, I'm putting you on 6, but they didn't, when they might have done a preventative thing if they had been more influential and been supportive of O'Neill when he was recognising there was discrimination and that the unionists had to reform. He was saying,
well, the people in the room are better qualified to talk about that sort of period than I am. But I mean, obviously in the 60s, when the letters to what was he call it, the housing group, he's showing an awareness of what's going on, but clearly up to Labour's there up until 1970, and then 70 to 74 it's Conservative government under Heath.
The British government, it's really the convention, it's really the influence of the convention where people wanted to get Northern Ireland on the agenda.
The Speaker's Convention?
No,
the Speaker's...
I mean the convention that you don't bring up anything about Northern Ireland in Parliament. That was a very powerful...
Yeah, that goes back to 25, was it?
I mean, an installment was...
But in the 60s...
Installment became a way for both major political parties in London to actually not have policies. I mean, I did want to ask a question about whether you uncovered any signs of a particular kind of development of Labour Party policy in general, not just the leaders' kind of day-to-day responses.
That's a much broader question, Eamon, than I want to get into here. You know, there's a whole, you know, there's books written on Labour policy on Northern Ireland, you know, and again, you know, there's other people better qualified to talk about that than me. You know, if you want to talk about the UWC strike and that period in 73, 74, I can certainly talk with more expertise about that.
No, I mean, what I'm thinking about really is that Wilson is, sorry, you know, Wilson's operating in a kind of policy vacuum. Is, I think, part of the context here.
Do you mean after 69 or
well,
68, 69?
He, you know, newly elected Prime Minister, leader of a party which, you know, for reasons Patricia has been talking about, doesn't seem to me to have fully developed policy on Northern Ireland at this time. In the absence of a fully developed policy of Northern Ireland over decades.
By 74?
Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, it's, the army are there, that, you know, the Heath government have tried to the Sunning deal or dealing with something.
Well, I think that to some extent they're faffing around, but I mean, even from like at least 72, when their Stormont is abolished, they're talking about a Lebanon-style government. So they're certainly talking about, you know, power sharing from at least 72, and you know, that's where we still are. You know, sort of, you know, moving around the edges. I mean, the difference is, you know, it's always interesting to look at Sunningdale and look at the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and you know, on the surface, they're both conciliation agreements, but you look at the context that they're operating in and the level of violence and the expectations people have and their demands. You know, even when we get to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, it takes another 18 months before the executive sits over various arguments, primarily decommissioning weapons, and that's in a much better environment than you have in 73, 74. And you know, you're talking about your prisoner releases. You know, was there any possibility that you could have done that? The army were certainly against it in 73, 74. Would it have been practicable to do it at that stage? And then compare that with what happens prisoner releases after 1998 in the Good Friday Agreement, because you've got the paramilitaries or the major paramilitaries are on ceasefire. So that provides the environment where you can actually do that. And yet with all that, it takes us years and we're still, you know, trimming around the edges and fiddling about to try and get as good a fit as we can on all the mini agreements we've had since 1998. So, you know, if you look at the context of 73, 74, when that was, you know, at best 72 through to the end of 73 to get the Sunningdale Agreement up and running, and really, you know, it's about a year, you know, even in the amount of time it has in a much worse environment. Compare that to 1998 and how difficult it was in that period, and you know, the years of negotiation it took to get to the Good Friday in 1998. You know, when people said, you know, that this, that, and the other, with the best of intentions, they think if this, that, and the other had happened in 73, 74, it might have worked. We could have saved all those lives. I think that's pie in the sky. I just don't think things could have happened in 73, 74 that would have led to a stable executive in that time, because the pressures were so great, the level of violence was so great, people's passions were so great that you could not have created a stable executive in that environment in 74. People get sometimes exercised about the UWC strike and saying if it hadn't been for the strike, the executive would have persisted. I don't think that's, I think that's completely untrue. Even without the strike, if the strike had failed in February 74, there was so much pressure on Falkender. He represented probably 30% of the unionist vote. There's no way that you could have created a stable executive in that sort of environment, and it's inevitable that it would have collapsed.
Okay, a question at the back, sorry.
Hi, just as on Gary's point, I'm Whitehall civil servant myself, and I know Diane has a lot of resistance here, so it's quite interesting to hear her perspective of it, not from here. But I'm quite interested to hear what was the prevalence of Whitehall civil servants in 1974 here. Was it just the NIO?
Well, I mean, the basic changeover was January 74 when the executive was supposed to take charge, and then you slightly reduced Northern Ireland executive, but you still had that split between the powers that the NIO had, and the executive was, after all, appointed by the Secretary of State, who was it, Francis Pym, early on, January through to the general election, and then Merlin Rees coming in March. So they nominally should have left all of those things, you know, the sort of day-to-day things like education and health and things, not obviously not justice, that was retained by the Northern Ireland office, but the other things like finance and personnel. For a long time with 6 different departments here, those things should have been done by executive ministers, but you still had the NIO there, and I think there were 2 other ministers as well as that, and their main thing would have been justice and security. So, you know, that was another kind of structural problem as well. You had that split between them, so you weren't getting the government forces, as it were, speaking with one voice. You had the executive speaking to certain things, and then you had the NIO, Merlin Rees, and the government looking after other things, and they weren't always online. You know, and as I mentioned, there, you know, they certainly on the SDLP side and the Irish government were expecting a much stronger response against the Ulster Workers Council, to send troops onto the streets and force them off the streets as a way of supporting the executive, and they didn't get the response that they did. Late in the day, you did get you did get the army taking over control of certain petrol stations and supplying petrol to people so they could go to work. But there were technical problems with the UWC strike, like, you know, stopping people blocking roads, because the way they operated a lot of the time was just to get people standing across the road. And then when the army showed up, they would just melt away. And then once the army left, they would block the road again, because the army just didn't have the manpower to be everywhere all the time. So Hugh Bennett's book's very good on that, if you want to look at that.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Just to give you some evidence about your claim about Sunningdale wouldn't have survived. Bob Cooper once told me on an interview years ago that when the like evidence became clear that there wasn't a majority unionist kind of block support for Sunningdale, because it was always pretty thin at the start. But then when it became obvious that it no longer existed, then even Cooper himself said that it would be hard to sustain. You know, you couldn't sustain something if you couldn't command a majority of a significant group under consociational arrangements. One thing I'd like to explore is the role of media, because the thing about the convention, one, for me, it's straightforward to see how Northern Ireland Assembly was established, Parliament was established, Northern Ireland got its home rule, and it was just supposed to take care of its affairs and not perturb the business of Westminster. 60 put paid to that, arguing with television, you know, and the role that media had in actually putting the stuff in your face. It was harder to ignore, particularly, I would argue, in Westminster. So my question to you is in regards to the speech itself. Was it not? It was televised, wasn't it? It was televised. And what, from your research, was there, you know, or even in your own opinion, you know, kind of what role that played? Whereas maybe 10 or 20 years earlier, something like that may not have been televised. You know, so I'm just wondering, since my argument is that post 68, a lot of this stuff, particularly everything in Northern Ireland, is now televised, and reaction to it is being televised. So this sounds to me like the first significant speech by a British Prime Minister on Northern Ireland that's televised in such a way. Your thoughts?
Can't think of any. I mean, you know, there's obvious, you know, there's key moments. There's, you know, not from the British government. I mean, there's, you know, the Ulster at the Crossroads speech.
Yes.
You know, by Terence O'Neill, you know, is another one.
Yes.
I'd be hard pressed to think of anything, but the way they did it, if I remember correctly, it was more sort of set piece productions at that stage. And now broadcast by the Prime Minister speaking to the nation, you know, that sort of thing, rather than, as you know, nowadays they kind of leak it out. So like the budgets is leaked well.
Had the British audience ever heard a speech like this before on Northern Ireland from the Prime Minister? you see what I'm saying?
I don't know offhand, you know.
Just thinking of audiences, obviously that speech is going to offend a Northern Ireland audience. But what about a British audience who is watching it too?
Yeah, well, that's why, I mean, you know, Austin Curry's saying, you know, it's not aimed at anybody over here. It's aimed at the British audience. And it's just, if I was trying to find the link, I did see it. It's on, I think, the BBC, was it called Review, is it? Rewind. I think it might be on that. And it's just he's almost spitting at times, the way that the sort of disdain he has, which is probably a reflection of what's going on. And after all, you know, 74, you know, they're worried about recruitment to the British Army is fallen in 74 to its lowest level, because of, you know, what's happening in Northern Ireland's a big factor in that, you know. So, you know, clearly he's appealing to that. So gets me back to my point. I think it's a combination of a lot of different factors, and the one that, when I was working on the Voices of 74 project, and I was just kind of looking at everything else that was going on at that period in time, what struck me was the Marcia Williams controversy and the periods for Marcia Williams, which I remembered happening at that time, but it hadn't struck me that it was exactly the same time that was going on. My suspicion is that he couldn't vent at the British press over Marcia Williams, but he could vent at Northern Ireland, because after all, what did it matter? It's a place apart, you know, and if you call them spongers, well, you know, people here will take umbrage. There's a comment in, was it Facebook? I can't remember where it was, about Oliver Napier and his wife were sitting having their dinner at the time in front of the TV having it, and she was so annoyed when she heard it that she dropped their dinner. You know, that wasn't, so it was pretty widespread. Obviously, you know, it would have ground home more with the unionists, but, you know, right across the spectrum, everybody took it as a bit of a slur. Yeah.
Yes, at the back.
Accepted, you know, within the system, when they often Robert Armstrong, to accept at the time that the strike could not have been countered by state forces. Yet 3 years later, 1977, a strike you don't mention, organised by very similar people to the ones who organised the 74 strike, with the stated aim of reversing, changing radically British security policy program. That was resisted by state forces, and it collapsed. Yeah,
totally different environment, but it's a mistake to try and compare those things, other than the fact that you have the word strike in it. There's an interesting thing. If you look at, there's the loyalist strike in 72, which is quite effective in protest about the introduction of direct rule, but it's only for a couple of days, but it's quite effective in shutting industry down for a couple of days. And then you've got one in 73, which is a loyalist one. It's a UDA essentially one, which drags in Vanguard along with it, and it's a complete disaster. You end up with, you know, the UDA shooting dead a fireman down Bradbury Place, just down the road there. Catholic churches being attacked. It's just an absolute disaster. 74 is kind of like an anomaly, because all of those things that worked in the favor of the loyalists came together at that particular time, and there was a lot of disgruntlement among unionists generally, and they were prepared to sort of tolerate what went on. 77, don't forget, by the end of 76, you've more than half of everybody who's killed during the course of the Troubles is dead by the end of 76. So things are starting to, you know, improve slightly more. There wasn't the sense that Northern Ireland was directly under immediate threat that there was in 74 as there was in 77. So they weren't able to coalesce that sort of unionist coalition, loyalist coalition in 77 as they were in 74. You didn't have some of the people involved in it. Glenn Barr, who was one of the key organisers in 74, wasn't involved in 77. He saw the 77 strike as a disaster, because he didn't have that sort of angst that was involved in 77. He was very much opposed to the UDA being involved, even though he dropped out by this stage. And he was trying to encourage Andy Turry and the UDA to stay out of it. But they got involved in it in Barr's view, it was people who hadn't got enough credit in 74, were trying to restage it again in 77 to try and show that they were the people who were important. Don't forget, Ian Paisley was a very minor figure in 74. He was just dragged along, literally put in his place at some of the strike committee meetings. In 77, he was very much at the forefront, threatened to give up politics if it didn't work, and then of course didn't do it. You know, I'm tempted to say there's elements of like a major American politician that you can see in Ian Paisley, which would be another interesting article today. But no, 77 it doesn't work, but it's because the background, the environment in 77 is very different than it is in 74, just as it is in 73 when they have the loyalist strike, which is a disaster, and in 72 when there's a short protest against the introduction of direct rule, but that's only for a couple of days. So no, I think you're right in saying that there was a more stronger response from the British government. Mason brought in the Spearhead Battalion to try and reassure the sort of midstream unionists. You know, you want more troops, there you go, there's your troops. And as soon as they talked the power workers out of going on strike, the troops were pulled out again about a week later. You know, but it was better organised. But no, the environment. I think you're wrong to try and compare 74 and 77. In the same way as you know 70, 72 and 73 are different as well. Sorry, Liam.
Sorry, in the middle, then we'll come to Liam. Yeah.
So obviously the early 1970s in Britain were a time of kind of various concerns over the state of British democracy and kind of governing legitimacy. The February 1974 election has a government in power who received less votes than the other party. And obviously, much of the content of that speech is about the state of British democracy. And you talk about that issue of audience. So to what extent do you think some of the messages in that speech were actually directed at the British audience and kind of reflecting what you can?
Probably most of it. It's kind of like that's the interesting thing about it is we'll never really know. So all you can go on is kind of like what does the evidence lead me to suggest, and I think most of it is geared towards that. So you know, as I mentioned, some of the pro Sunningdale speakers come to the conclusion that like he's not speaking to us at all. It's aimed at the British government, and you know, if you look at the actual text, there's only that one piece that I mentioned where he refers to people in Northern Ireland, you know, your fellow citizens in the UK. Elsewhere, it's all about, you know, we're paying for your mess. You know, it's our boys that are fighting over there, and very much is like Northern Ireland is a different part. And that as well is something that gets on the nerves of unionists who see themselves as very much being part of the UK. So there's almost that kind of like differing worldviews as well between the two. But I think it is mostly, you know, it's aimed at the UK audience, at a British audience rather than a Northern Ireland audience. But still, you know, the tetchiness is just, for an experienced politician at that level, it still astounds me that he would do that. So there's obviously something going on, and that's where I fall back to saying, you know, it's interesting that the Marcia Williams thing is going on at that time. And again, you know, it's speculation on my part, but I think you can make a strong point for saying that's something that's very much in his mind, and he's just venting over Northern Ireland because he can get away with it.
Okay, yeah.
Gordon, thank you. That's great. I just wonder how much of a role intimidation had in 1974, if to any extent, because that clearly would shape how you conceptualize what's going on. You know, whether it's a political strike or something much more serious than that. Do you want to say a little bit about? Well,
I mean, clearly intimidation is a major factor. There's different levels of it as well. If you look at the statistics, the main thing is actually telephone calls, if I remember correctly. If you look at the RUC statistics, it's a sort of major increase in threats, and then there's the kind of, you know, people receiving threatening calls, and then there's the kind of the veiled threat, you know, where people would stand outside the you know, the works, or in some instances would go in and say, you've got so much time to get out of here. You know, famously the Harland and Wolff, or, you know, the UDA paramilitaries go in and say, you know, anybody who's not out of here by the afternoon, your car's going to be burnt. You know, so there's different levels, and then you take it to the extreme where, you know, you've got you know, you've got at the same time like the horrendous bombs in Dublin and Monaghan. You know, how far this, you know, how far is that connected to the UWC strike is another question. But intimidation is clearly a part of it. And I mean, I can tell you what Glenn Barr's statement on it would have been was, you know, we had to intimidate people in the first few days to get them on side, because people didn't want to lose their pay, even though they supported what we were trying to do. But after the first couple of days, once they were out on strike, then they fell in behind us. That would have been his view, but that's a very benevolent view of intimidation in the strike.
Thank you. Peter.
Thanks very much. Really interesting paper. I totally agree with what you're saying. It's really interesting, this idea of the context of stress and the tensions, and that's all very important. But would you still not think that what Wilson is saying, whatever the context, he means what he says? Because going back to the points that Graham was making, there's precursors there about not having a good opinion of Northern Ireland and unionists and whatever it is. But even after this, Wilson's government, still in the time he's got left, then commissions, I mean, you made some reference to there in the talk, it does commission a significant study of withdrawal, and really considers the possibility, even though the conclusions are pretty obvious, it would be strategically disastrous, etc. But Wilson really does push it even afterwards. And if you add all that up, you know, there's a broad consistency, you know, meeting the IRA, these comments. So while not taken away from what you say, it does sound like there's vent in there too. But the very fact that you even are saying that, it looks like he wrote the speech, there is an essential consistency that Wilson genuinely didn't believe the British government could produce a solution. And it fits with what you're saying about him. I think you're totally right that it presents Northern Ireland as a place apart and so on. But this is Wilson, however unrealisable it is that he genuinely believes not that the problem can't be resolved by the British government.
Well, I mean, the two things that come to mind is, I mean, again, something I'm sure, you know, Peter, Paul Bowie would always say, you know, like the Irish government's very important in this when they get wind of the fact that the British are seriously thinking about withdrawal from Northern Ireland, saying, what the hell are you thinking about? You know, we can't deal with it. Are you serious? But the other thing was interesting is Joe Haynes' book. Was it Inside Number 10, I think it's called. And in that he says, you know, we were seriously considering withdrawal, and we knew that would lead to a lot of deaths. But in the long run, it would be good. And you're sort of thinking, yeah, right, in the long run, how many thousands of people would have to die before things were better in the long run, you know? But I was kind of shocked that he, you know, they would even contemplate that. But it showed you as you say, the sort of thinking that was going on, and they were to some extent serious about it. I mean, it was at the conference down in UU earlier in the year. I don't know, and it was interesting to hear, you know, some of the Irish diplomats from the period talking about that, and they were quite rational about it. And it's interesting in a lot of ways they were much more restrained about the prospect of a united Ireland in the short term than some of the people in the British government were, in particular Wilson's kitchen cabinet.
It's not just Wilson, right? Haynes as well.
Haynes as well, you know. Donoghue, I think, is maybe a bit more. Got to be careful because they're both still alive. Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean, you're an expert in this period as well, Peter. You know, I mean, that's what I find interesting about it. There's just so much going on, and a lot of it can be quite conflicting, and trying to make some sense out of it. But it's you know, it's you know, Dickens comments, the best of times, the worst of times. or the Chinese saying, you know, may you live in interesting times. It was a very interesting time to be alive in Northern Ireland in 1974.
Some people think it was the best at times.
Well, I've got the T-shirt to prove it.
James, you ask a question.
Gordon, just with the lens that you're viewing this through, it really stands out the power of organised labour across the UK in different ways.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested if you think about this comparison of what people were saying in 1984, if at all they had anything to reflect on UWC in 1984. You know, what was Harry Murray thinking about UWC in 1984? What was the labour movement? You know, how did the labour movement here reflect? You know, we all know the kind of the stance, the ineffective stance they took in '74. But you know, how did the labour movement more broadly reflect on this?
Yeah,
you know,
but
but
remember, James, I mean, like the world had changed by that stage as well. I mean, even by that's why, you know, '74 is kind of different, let alone all the political stuff. You look at the economic situation, you know, the heavy industry, which is the backbone of unionist power, that's very much in decline. And, you know, by '77, it's already, it's gone down. And by the time you get to '84, I mean, as somebody who worked in Barber Threads in Lisburn in the early '80s, you know, I know from personal experience, you know, you could see people were being made redundant all the way, including myself. You know, so you know, that was just one element of the decline in that sort of textiles and heavy industry thing. So by the time you get to '84, it's very different. But the other thing, interviewing Harry Murray, I remember you saying, like, even after the '74 strike, they tried to get a lot of workers together and have a more sort of loyalist workers, working class organization. And right from the outset, they were being infiltrated and being undermined by the Ulster Unionist Party. I said it was not the DUP. He says, no, it was the UUP once it was shown. So anytime they were trying to organise something that was a more specifically working class organisation, you had people from the UUP were infiltrating it to try and kill it at birth. So I thought that was interesting. Anything else, James? How's Ballymena doing?
That's a topic for another conversation.
I suppose it was the 1984. That's the kind of, you know, the death of organised labour in UK. You know.
Yeah.
You know,
and again, you know,
it's an interesting lens to think.
Yeah. I mean, I was saying to Peter here, you know, if this proves successful, I'm going to do Bruce Springsteen, born in the USA, and the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and then Celine Dion, My Heart Will Go On, and the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. You know.
Look, anyone waiting to come in online?
Someone had a hand up, but they seem to have left. So.
Yeah, probably bored.
But I mean, I would just maybe finish on that question. So, I mean, Bowie obviously forms a kind of dystopian soundtrack to all of this going on in '74. But does he have any opinions himself on the North?
Someone that apparently he was at some. He was at, I can't remember the date, just the other day, the joys of the internet, which is, you know, always is true. Apparently he was at some conference and he said, Chucky our lad, at one of them. I wish I'd made a note of it now. But just, my one Bowie concert was actually 1990 down in Dublin. And, you know, given that it started with us talking about people's recollections of the events between '69 and '74 and the Voices of '74 project, now available at all good Ulster museums. When I was looking this up, and I remembered that my one David Bowie concert was 1990, I could have sworn it was at the King's Hall. And yet when it dug out the programme, it was definitely down in Dublin. So then raises the question about how reliable or maybe it's just me. You know?
Gordon, thanks very much. That was great.
Now available, buy your CDs of.
I don't think you need to promote David Bowie, but for those who are interested in following through the Voices of '74 project, it's all on the Ulster Museum website,
yeah.
And there's some material also to view in the exhibition over there as well, which Gordon has been involved with. So thank Gordon for presentation up today. Obviously dealing with events 50 years ago today, so you know, next year we'll have you back to
and the speech